of the Aspen Security Forum. Please join me in thanking all who have made this remarkable forum possible. And I'm thinking in particular of my Aspen Institute colleagues, Clark Irvin, Rob Thomas, Elliot Gerson, and their team, along with the dozens of colleagues who put up tents and made meals and cleaned buildings and transported travelers from all around the country to get here. Thank you to everybody who made this possible. It is wonderful to have Commander of U.S. Cyber Command and National Security Director, General Paul Nakasone, here, and the BBC's Gordon Corera for a discussion on countering old threats and new. Needless to say, these last few days have been quite a convening. After our opening session with FBI Director Christopher Wray on Wednesday night, I needed to travel to Washington, D.C. for some meetings, and I just got back late last night. Well, while I was in D.C., Associate Attorney General Rod Rosenstein, National Intelligence Director Dan Coates, both made honest, unvarnished comments about the destructive behaviors of Russia in relation to our national security, elections, internal unity, and our standing in the world even. And it was like parallel universes, standing in Washington, D.C., and reading the media coming from my home here in Aspen, Colorado. Washington, D.C. right now, to me, stands paralyzed like we've never seen it before, while Vladimir Putin and his people are making pronouncements about a new bilateral agenda that we're all going to learn about someday. Much of D.C. seems to have laryngitis and maybe amnesia, waiting for the next shoe to drop. And then, conversely, there's Aspen, Colorado. Admittedly, not normally thought of as the epicenter of hard-nosed, fact-based realism. However, it's clear that over the past 4 days, there has been no more concentrated, candid, principled, nonpartisan, and patriotic commentary on the nature of U.S.-Russia relationship and more broadly all of our security threats than the Aspen Institute's on-the-record convening right here. It has been extraordinary. And I say on the record with intentional emphasis and real pride. I'd like to express our collective gratitude to the government officials who joined us at the Aspen Security Forum to talk and think together and answer the uncensored questions of skilled reporters and moderators who prepared diligently for the interviews. Government accountability and freedom of the press are the American way in good times and bad. Thank you. And it's quite the opposite in Putin's Russia. There, power doesn't open itself up to media inquiries. Power avoids questions, smears reporters, locks them up, or worse, as we know, from the 2006 assassination of Anna Politkovskaya and dozens since then, documented by the Committee to Protect Journalists and others. Our tradition is different, and our systems are not equivalent. They weren't equivalent when Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Lech Walesa and Václav Havel were working as dissidents under death threats. They weren't equivalent when President Reagan called on Mr. Gorbachev to tear down that wall. They aren't equivalent today in an era when cyber technologies allow Russia and, yes, other countries to steal, stalk, spy, attack our processes of elections, and incite civil discord within our population. It is not equivalent, and this forum has laid that out again and again over these past few days. We can't turn a blind eye to the real and complex dangers of the modern world. September 11th taught us that. This forum has reminded us of that. And that's why it's so valuable. 3 big reasons. First, the Aspen Security Forum helps us confront the fact that we must see and stop the risks that threaten our nation's security and our way of life. We must confront those risks in real ways. Second, this forum allows us to practice and model the democratic virtues that bind us to one another as Americans and the great democratic nations who are our long-standing allies. And third, this forum working at the highest level of security expertise and commitment to our Constitution, allows us to join hands, not as Republicans or Democrats or independents, but as Americans. Thank you all for being here. It's been a great few days. Thank you very much. And now it's my pleasure to welcome to the podium Clark Urban, the chairman of the Aspen Security Forum. Clark.
Well, everyone, you've heard enough from me over the course of these few days. And thank you, Dan, for those powerful words that I think set the stage perfectly for tonight's concluding session. To introduce tonight's concluding session, I'm pleased to introduce Mark Pasquale, who's the Vice President and General Manager of Special Programs at Lockheed Martin Space. Mark.
Thank you, Clark. It's my distinct honor to introduce our next session, Countering Threats, Old and New. Our speaker tonight, General Paul Nakasone, is a tremendous leader and seasoned officer charged with confronting some of the most significant national security challenges facing our country today. His military roots run deep, as his father is a retired Army colonel with military intelligence background. General Nakasone's noteworthy career of service spans from employment of classic hard power during deployments abroad to the burgeoning and ill-defined combat domain of cyberspace. As both the director of the National Security Agency and the commander of the United States Cyber Command, he's not only responsible for a vital component of the intelligence community, but for shaping the future of U.S. military capability and resolve in the evolving virtual world. With his impressive background, there's no better person to wear both indispensable hats. We're also privileged to have as our moderator tonight, Mr. Gordon Corera. Gordon joined the BBC in 1997 and was selected as a BBC News security correspondent in 2004, focusing on terrorism, cybersecurity, and intelligence matters. He's also recently published a book called Cyberspace. Before us is a fantastic opportunity to hear from a leader of those that safeguard our nation every day. So please join me in welcoming Gordon Corera and General Nakasone.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for joining us for the last session of what's been a fantastic forum, and it's a great privilege to be able to moderate this. Now, as we just heard, General Nakasone wears two hats, not literally, because that would be a bit weird, but two hats as Director NSA and the head of Cyber Command. So he's here really primarily talking in the Cyber Command capacity, and I think it's a chance to explore what Cyber Command does, how it works, the threats that are out there in cyberspace, the challenges posed by new technology as well. But first of all, I just wanted to learn a bit more about you, because you've been in this post only for a couple of months, but you grew up in the digital age, didn't you? I mean, your career has been focused in a way on this cyber issue, perhaps more than others in the past. Did you start off as a kid being interested in computers? Did you join the military thinking you were going to do cyber? How did you end up here?
So Gordon, first of all, thank you very much. I'd like to first of all thank the Aspen Security Forum for putting this on today. Obviously to all of you who have stayed throughout the entire day for this last piece of it. And I must admit that I feel like the person that's at the party that didn't get the invite in terms of what you should wear. But nonetheless, let me begin. Before I talk about myself, let me talk about U.S. Cyber Command. Because 9 years ago, I was at the National Security Agency working for the director named Keith Alexander, and he said, I've got this idea. Now, for those of you that know Keith Alexander, that's either you run or you hide, and I missed both opportunities. So over a period of a year, myself and 3 other officers put together this concept of Cyber Command, brought it from the ground up, designed it, and in 2010 it started. And for myself, I would tell you, I've watched the birth, really, to steal a term from a great Secretary of State, present at the creation, have seen the development of U.S. Cyber Command throughout the years. And I would tell you that we have built a force, we have trained that force, we've equipped that force, we've employed that force. It's a well-prepared force, it's a ready force, it's a learning force. In terms of my own experiences that you asked, I would trace it really back to 2007 when I landed at the National Security Agency, pretty sure that my career was done. And they told me, hey, you're going to be in charge of support to military operations. And so over the period of 3 years, I really learned a lot about our agency in terms of what they could do for forward deployed forces. And I would tell you, it was incredible. The technologies that we talk about today, cloud technology, AI, big data, we were doing that in 2008 and 2009 in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. And if you read the memoirs of some of the commanders on the ground, you see how impactful a small group of agency people, forward deployed, had on the eventual outcome in the surge. I transitioned from there to command of our Cyber National Mission Force, and I've also had the opportunity to command most recently Army Cyber Command, where I was also commander of our Joint Task Force Ares, which you may know is the element that does offensive cyber operations against ISIS. And so through that, I guess, over the past 10 years, I've seen really the development of a very, very capable and, as I said, ready force.
What did you learn from those operations against ISIS?
What I learned is, I think the first thing is that it really gets down to a very, very small group of people. So we talk about the technology all the time. We found the right leader for JTF Ares, a one-star that is currently now with the command. We found the right people across the services, and we put together very, very small teams. We worked with our partners. I mean, I think many of you have read what GCHQ has done. And I would also tell you that we had development that was paired with our operators, so we could actually develop our capabilities on the fly. It was a very, very dynamic environment.
And this is going after ISIS, going after its cyber operations, its ability to communicate.
This is going after in support of forces forward in northern Iraq, in Syria, in other places around the world, ISIS. And it's also not on the ground, but it's also as they move to a virtual presence. That's a very, very difficult concept that you work through as time goes by.
Now, as you took over in May, Cyber Command became a Unified Combatant Command. What does that mean in practice?
It means in practice that there are 10 unified commands across our force. The Joint Force organizes under combatant commands to do our warfighting. So it provides a very, very streamlined chain of command from the President to the Secretary of Defense to the combatant commander. It gives increased resources. And I would tell you, it also gives a signal to not only our nation, but to our allies and adversaries that cyberspace is an incredibly important domain upon which we operate.
Cyber Command now has 133 mission teams. What do they do?
133 mission teams. Each of the services, our force services, are responsible for building these teams. They're offensive teams, they're defensive teams, they're support teams. They do everything from defensive work to ensure that our networks, our data, our weapon systems are protected, to doing offensive operations against our adversaries, as I described, against ISIS and others.
So, I mean, are they day by day, are they battling adversaries in cyberspace, trying to keep them off networks or trying to take them on? Is that the kind of thing that we're talking about? Or are they preparing plans for future operations? What's the balance?
So yes. Let me expound upon that a bit.
Thank you.
So this is an environment, I think we should talk a little bit about cyberspace, right? So cyberspace is an environment upon which you have to be engaged every single day. You have to be engaged, understanding what your adversaries are doing. So certainly in terms of what our defensive teams are doing, what we're doing to prepare and plan for future operations, that's all part of that. And it's all very interesting to note that across those 133 teams, we took really some lessons learned from the stand-up of Special Operations Command. What did we learn from SOCOM? We learned the fact that there was power in having a joint standard, that it wasn't just an Army team or a Navy team or an Air Force team. There was a joint standard, so when a joint force commander like myself gets a team, the standard is the same. And I think that's a very powerful lesson that we learned from SOCOM and one that we've been able to put into practice every single day.
There's a phrase in your vision statement about continuous engagement. What does that mean?
So again, this idea, and let me come back to our adversaries. So I would tell you that what we've seen our adversaries do over a period of years is the fact that they operate below the threshold level of war. So that they steal intellectual property. They steal PII, or information on personnel. They cause discord within our social ranks or attempt to undermine our elections, all below the level of war. And so this idea of how do you engage that force is something that I believe needs to be on a continual basis. It fits very, very closely to our national defense strategy that talks about strategic competition. If you think about strategic competition and the idea of, our adversaries every single day are looking upon which that they can have a campaign or a strategic outcome against us, I look at that in cyberspace as well. So one ability of our adversaries to take our intellectual property may not mean a lot, but over time, you see this as a campaign, and over time this has a strategic impact. Over time this has perhaps a strategic impact on our nation's economy and our national security.
So it's about contesting that. It's about, because people say cyberspace, the boundaries between war and peace are not the same as in regular military conflict. There's a kind of grey space in between in which things are happening all the time, and you're engaged in that. Is that the idea?
I do believe that. I think that there is an engagement every single day that either you're monitoring your force, or you're imposing costs on that force, or you're understanding what that force wants to do. That's really important.
And does that involve, in terms of just defending, I mean, you hear people talk about it's important not just to do goal line defense. In other words, not just to be the goalkeeper defending your networks against attacks coming at you, but a bit like in football, or as you might call it, soccer, going and attacking your opponent. Is that what it takes sometimes? Not just to be sitting back and trying to defend, but actually trying to get to them before and keep them off balance, or to try and attack them before they attack you?
So this continuous engagement, and I think you hit an important point. It's at one time playing offense, one time playing defense. It's the idea of what you might be doing in an adversary's network to learn what they're doing that might improve your own defenses. It's ensuring that what we may be doing against the adversary, we're protected against our defenses. It's also this idea that we want to have our forces to be able to enable our defensive capabilities and to act forward. Act outside the boundaries of the United States, to understand what our adversaries are doing and be able to engage those adversaries, and obviously being able to better protect our networks, our data, and our weapon systems.
Let me ask you what might sound a simple question, but in cyberspace is a complicated one. What are you there to defend? I mean, some of the talk already over the last few days has been government can't be expected to defend everything in cyberspace. There's all kinds of threats out there from non-state actors, hackers, but also you have other states targeting private companies. Where do the boundaries lie between what you defend as the military, what the government defends, and what you expect people to defend themselves?
So great question. So my remit, what I'm tasked to do is, first of all, to defend our Department of Defense networks. It's not only the networks, it's our data, it's our weapon systems. I think within the United States, the Department of Homeland Security has the responsibility for the defense of our critical infrastructure. And so there's a partnership there. As we can enable, or we are asked to assist, certainly that goes through a process, and the Department of Defense would answer that request. But I think it's really what we've learned over time is that that partnership has to continue to grow, has to continue to get stronger. And so while our focus, our authorities right now are within clearly the protection of our own networks within the Department of Defense, we are also an available force upon which, if the nation needs it, can be called on.
In other words, because we've seen instances where you had, if you go back to 2014, you had the North Koreans targeting, a private company, Sony. That would not typically be something you'd expect the military to be called in to defend. But in the future, can you imagine that kind of scenario? Someone saying this requires you to be involved in helping defend against this, and that would come from coordination with the Department for Homeland Security, would it?
Certainly, and I guess I would take a step back and say, at the end of the day, what does the Department of Defense do? It defends the nation. And so if called upon, then I would certainly imagine whatever scenario that you could draw, if called upon, our Department of Defense would answer that call.
Let's talk a bit about the threats which are out there in cyberspace. let's start with the one that everyone's been talking about at this conference, Russia. How do you see the threat from Russia, and what are you doing about the threat from Russia?
So I think many of you know, you may have read that I stood up a Russia group, Russia small group, the RSG. That is true. It's in line with what the intelligence community has really been doing since, post 2016, 2017, upon which, making sure that we understand in which we operate. That fits very, very clearly with, the requirements and the direction I've received from the Secretary and certainly our administration, but also fits in terms of how I look at problem sets. Again, coming back to my own experiences, I see small groups that come together that bring capabilities after an adversary. In terms of how I look at the threats, again, coming back to this idea of strategic competition that we look at as a nation now, certainly Russia, a near-peer threat, great capabilities upon which we will certainly be called upon, and if called upon, I think no doubt we will ensure that we act.
One of the things that's been striking over the last few years is the escalation and the proliferation of cyber attacks. So we've seen escalation in terms of countries being willing to go further than we'd seen before. Russia allegedly turning off a power plant in the Ukraine. We've seen proliferation. We've seen countries which previously weren't seen as having high-end attack capability, kind of Iran, North Korea, carry out pretty sophisticated attacks. What worries you most? I mean, what are you seeing in terms of the threats coming next?
So I would answer this in a couple of different scenarios as I've seen it over the past really 10 years. We began the discussion of threats with the idea that our adversaries, may be doing, exploitation or what we would consider, spying on our networks. And then that advanced to disruption. This is the whole denial of service attacks that we had seen from our adversaries. And then on the very, very high end, the idea of destruction and what you had indicated with Sony Pictures America. But I think there's also been some other trends that we should recognize. In the spring of 2011, in April of 2011, Arab Spring, we looked at this in terms of, and I would say myself included, as, wow, this is an indicator of how powerful a free and open internet can be in the world. And we looked at this and from that lens. But I would also say that our adversaries looked at it from a completely different lens, an existential threat to their existence. And so what have you seen since then? I would say the weaponization of information, the idea of being able to control a populace with this information. And I think that's an incredibly important trend that we're starting to see. And the other one I would say is certainly the idea of data and the importance of data, the stealing of data, the importance of being able to secure your data. This is all, I think, the trends that we've seen over the couple years that I've certainly noticed.
I mean, your focus is on cyber, but it's striking how Russia in particular has integrated cyber with other forms of activity, what they call hybrid warfare, or what some people call hybrid warfare, in which they might be linking cyber attacks with unconventional warfare and troops going in undercover into the Ukraine, or it might be hacking emails but then releasing them through social media, or countering that kind of hybrid threat in which cyber is just one part of it. That's a challenge, isn't it? Because that requires the US government as well, working across different agencies and departments as well. Do you think the US government is ready? Is it equipped? Should it be able to fight that kind of hybrid warfare, either to defend it or to be able to do it itself?
So let me begin at more of a tactical level, because I think the Secretary of the Army today in his talk indicated, I think, something very important, and that is we've recognized this importance of hybrid warfare within our Army, within our Marine Corps on the ground. We've already started to take actions and started to train at places like the National Training Center that incorporates the idea of information warfare with a ground combat element. I think that this is really instructive of how far that our thinking has come in terms of we have to have this capability within our tactical forces. Certainly within our nation. This is an important piece of it that has to be a whole-of-nation approach. And I do think our nation is capable of it. This is not something new. This is something that we've done previously. This is something that we have, I certainly grew up with it during the Cold War, have done very effectively, and I think we will do it again.
So it requires that whole-of-nation approach to deal with cyber and hybrid and these kind of new threats that we're facing.
Most certainly.
There's a lot of talk about foreign presence on the critical national infrastructure. I know you said that was a Department of Homeland Security issue partly, but in terms of dealing with it, is there a role for the military in deterrence, in being able to say, we are going to deter you from coming into our networks. And do you think there's been enough on that? Because I think in your confirmation hearing, the question came up, has enough been done to deter Russia and other countries from carrying out these kind of cyber attacks in America? And you suggested it hadn't been. Are you looking at ways of actually trying to create that kind of deterrence?
So I come back to the idea of persistently engaged. We should anticipate in this domain, within cyberspace, that our adversaries will continue to penetrate and try to penetrate such things as our critical infrastructure. What should we do about that? And I think it's both the idea of being vigilant about that, certainly. It's also the idea of being able to act forward in terms of understanding what your adversaries may be doing within their own networks. And then I think it's the idea of enabling, the idea of what's the partnership that's most effective to ensure that the Department of Homeland Security is armed with and has the information and both the capabilities upon which to deal with these type of threats.
But do you think there is a sense yet of how deterrence looks in the cyber age? Because it doesn't look the same as nuclear deterrence, does it? It doesn't look, I mean, some people posit that you could have a kind of mutually assured destruction in which they're inside, our critical national infrastructure, we're inside theirs, no one's going to switch it off because they're too scared of the consequences. That's one possible view of deterrence, a kind of nuclear style. But do you think that's a realistic concept? Because cyber is quite different from the nuclear world, isn't it? In terms of being able to attribute attacks, to know who's doing it, that can take time. It's different from a missile coming in.
So certainly there is differences in terms of where we operate in cyberspace. If you think about, first of all, let's begin with the idea of monopoly of power. In the nuclear realm, certainly nations or nation states had the monopoly of power. In cyberspace, that's one of the things that we all learn. There's no one nation, no one company, there's no one academic institution that has all the technology, all the talent, all the ability upon which they can move. The second thing is the barriers for entry into this domain of cyberspace are much different. They're very low and getting increasingly lower. And so many can operate in here. And so I would offer that deterrence is a bit different. But the idea of being able to impose cost, yes, I think that there is something there with regards to that deterrent effect. But I think it's something that we continue to have to work at as we move forward with our forces, obviously with our whole-of-nation approach as well.
Because this issue of raising costs and deterring, it has its risks as well, doesn't it? Because if you respond, there are risks of escalation. The US is the most digitally wired of any country, therefore in some ways you're the most vulnerable to a cyber attack. It's complicated, isn't it?
So our times are complicated. Here, cyberspace is a complicated area. But let me come back to the idea of our adversaries right now are operating below a threshold level of war to steal our intellectual property, to steal our PII, to steal our information. They are not looking to raise that level. If you have some type of engagement, obviously we believe that has an effect on them.
You contest the space effectively.
And then I would offer that as you think about that, if you do not do that, who establishes the norms upon which you operate? It's our adversaries. And so I think that that's one of the areas that I think about as I tend to think about this idea.
So that perhaps suggests there hasn't been done enough has been done in the past to contest the space day to day with what our adversaries are doing, and that's something you want to move forward on.
So I would come back to we're a learning force. I think this is part of that. I think this is how that over time that we will adopt and adapt and certainly move forward.
Let's look at a bit ahead at the challenges and the technology of the future. I mean, early on, cyber was referred to as another domain of warfare like land, air, sea, space. But it's different, isn't it? Because it's a man-made domain, cyber. The technology is constantly changing. The environment of cyberspace is changing. How much of a challenge does that pose to you, particularly when, perhaps in the past, America has been able to shape that environment, but increasingly other countries, other nations are shaping it as well?
Partnerships.
Partnerships.
Let me talk a little about partnerships, because partnerships for me really kind of talk about the advent of technology, talent management, all those things that we want to be able to leverage as a force. We talk about partnerships in our national defense strategy, about the key piece of that. I would tell you we've learned that in cybercom as well. What are the partnerships that you're going to develop with your allies, industry, academia, the interagency? These are partnerships that are incredibly important. I would offer to you that, again, this idea of no one holds the monopoly on good ideas and technology, the idea that technology is spreading and changing so fast, these partnerships are incredibly important. to be able to ensure that your game is at a very, very high level.
What are the technological changes that you think are going to change the domain of cyberspace? I mean, is it 5G? Is it artificial intelligence? What are the things that are on your agenda or you're looking at thinking, this is going to change my world and the world in which the military operates?
So 5G, let me begin just on 5th generation. I'm a person that remembers 1st generation. I was a young lieutenant, and the general had an aide who had this phone that was, of course, an analog phone. We didn't know that. But it had push buttons, and I was like, wow, that'd be cool to have that. And then by the late early 1900s, we had 2nd generation. And the neat thing about 2nd generation, of course, is the fact that we could text. And the idea of texting. And by the late 1990s, we had smartphones. And then, of course, 4th generation. We are on the cusp of 5th generation. And I am reminded at how much this is going to change what we do in terms of the speed at the point of end. And so this endpoint of being able to be at 10 gigabits, the idea of being able to instantly download things, these are things that I think will radically change what we're going to do. And I would offer that it offers both tremendous opportunities for our nation. Think about how we can change our industry, our medical capabilities, our economy, but it also offers a certain amount of challenge in terms of how do we ensure that this hardware that is being produced is trusted, is able for us to be able to leverage when we want it and have the trusted and verification that it's going to be is going to be secure.
Because that's one of the challenges which was discussed here at the forum, I think it was yesterday, was that perhaps it won't just be America building 5G, it maybe will be other countries who are building some of that technology. Does that worry you, China particularly?
So I certainly would offer it's something we need to think about. This is so tremendously important. Think about what the internet means to our economy today and what 5G will do to it in the future. Ensuring that we have a baseline of capability within our nation to produce that hardware and that software, I think, is incredibly important.
And, I mean, China has talked about wanting to become a world leader in artificial intelligence by 2030. That must worry you as well.
So again, I think that as with anything, we take great credence in what our adversaries are going to say, and we watch that. But I would also say that this is a country of innovation. This is a country that has developed the internet. This is a country that has brought the idea of apps and iPhones and everything else that my kids enjoy every single day to the forefront. This is a country that I'll certainly bet on for the future.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? Because America has been in the lead for innovation. I mean, Silicon Valley itself was partly built on research for the NSA and the Pentagon and other places. In the 90s, you saw Silicon Valley itself kind of take off and, if you like, move ahead of the private sector, moving ahead of government in terms of technological development. But now you start to see other countries really pushing ahead, particularly China, in terms of their ability to take the lead in some of this technology. How much of a problem is it for you, though, that when it comes to working with Silicon Valley is still perhaps nervous about working with you? I mean, this is partly a legacy of the Snowden revelations 5 years ago. There's a nervousness which doesn't clearly exist in China when it comes to their Silicon Valley, their technology companies working. Do you find that? Are you worried about the relationships there?
Partnerships? I come back to the idea of partnerships in terms of we have developed very, very strong partnerships with those in Silicon Valley, those in Austin, those in Boston, a number of different areas. Let me give you an example. In the Army, we work very closely with Defense Digital Services. Many of you may have heard of them. They bring tremendous talent to our force to work with our young people. They bring new ideas. They bring fresh insights. They bring, a little bit of non-military thinking to a very military force. Incredibly important for us because we operate in a domain that changes so rapidly. I have not experienced that. I've been out to the Valley. I've had our soldiers and civilians head out to the Valley to talk to different companies. And so I've heard, and I've certainly am aware of the stories in terms of some of the challenges that some have expressed, but that's not been the reception that I've received.
Because I think there was Google, Project Maven, there was this desire not to engage on certain military projects. You've not found that when you've been out there. You've not sensed that nervousness.
So I don't think that should mean that we should stop engaging. I think that the most important thing we need to do is engage. That the dialogue that goes on between what we're doing and what the private sector can do is incredibly important, so that they know who Paul Nakasone is and who works for me and others, and understand what we're trying to do. I think that's pretty powerful.
And where do you see the cyberspace changing? What's the environment going to look like in 5 years? We didn't know how it was going to look like 5 years ago today, but do you have any sense, or is part of the point you just have to be flexible and adapt?
So I think the latter is really true. So I'm an intelligence officer by training, and I would offer that my predictions always haven't been right on.
Okay. You want to give me some examples of that, or
So
feel free?
I'll defer on that.
We're being
Gordon.
live streamed, but
But I would offer is, I think that many of us, as we take a look at the future, one of the things that we do know is that this is a dynamic area. And the most important thing we can do is prepare for that dynamism. So how do we do that? How do we get the right people that we want into our force? How do we encourage those people to stay with us? How do we ensure that we have the right partnerships? How do we take a look at the technologies that are going to leverage us to a higher readiness? Those are things that I think are much better ways to spend our time than necessarily certain predictions.
let's talk about people then, because you mentioned that. How do you recruit the best people? I mean, you cannot compete with the salaries that are being offered on Silicon Valley, and we know that there is a shortage of expertise when it comes to cyber skills.
My experience has been both as the commander of U.S. Cyber Command and the director of NSA is we do a tremendous job recruiting people. In our agency this year, we're going to recruit several thousand people to come work with us. We have an attraction that is magnetic, and that's the same way in cybercom as well. We do a great job at training that force as well. Here's where I would tell you that we still have a ways to go, and that's the retention piece of it.
Okay.
This is a challenge. There is no doubt about it, because this is a dynamic environment upon which we live. The people that we recruit are very interested in challenges, and when the challenges are there, they're most interested in exploring those. But there are other challenges also in the world, and so what do we do as a force, whether at the agency or the command, to adapt to that? I think there's a couple of things that we have to do. First of all, I would tell you that we have to recognize that there are gradations of talent within our force. I've talked about this before. You know, there's an idea of, I have people within cybercom today that I would call 50x performers. What's 50x mean? It means that they're 50 times better than their peers, whether or not that's coding, whether or not that's an on-net operator, whether or not that's software developer. They are so good that they do the work of many. Those are the ones we can't afford to lose. And that goes on the same way with the agency as well. And so what does that mean? We have to think of ways that we can be dynamic enough to ensure that they're interested to stay with our force. I think the other thing we have to also do is realize that this is probably not going to be a force that's going to be like myself, that comes in and anticipates doing 20 years or 30 years and then has a nice retirement and goes off to retirement. This is a dynamic force that comes and goes. And I think that we have to be recognize that as we move forward.
That's a slightly different model, isn't it? You mean people will perhaps rotate between the private sector and cyber command and the military and go back and forth, and you'll be able to encourage, incentivize, pay them to do that?
So when I go out to the Valley, one of the things that strikes me is that people change, right? They change different places where they work, but they stay in that valley there. It's almost as, many call it the ecosystem upon which they operate. That's a pretty healthy piece. I mean, that they're operating within that, and that they're doing other things. Why not have that same ecosystem within our government? If they're not going to work within the military, maybe it's within the intelligence community. Maybe it's within the other parts of the interagency. Maybe it's within private sector. I think the other thing, and it's one of the things that I've done as the director, is I don't think you should ever be afraid to pick up the phone and call those people and say, hey, how about coming back to the agency? This is a really interesting place to work. We'd like to have you back. It's interesting how much power that has some days.
And do you feel that you'll end up looking a bit different from the rest of the military? I mean, maybe you do already. Maybe if you walk around, not you personally, sorry. Wasn't a personal comment. I meant Cyber Command. If I was to walk around Cyber Command, I'd love to tomorrow, but would it look different? Would it look different in terms of who's there, the kind of people who are there from other parts of the military? What would it look like? How diverse is your workforce?
So our workforce is, if you take a look at it, it's 80% military, it's 20% civilian. The diversity in looks, certainly, but I would offer, how about the diversity in thought? I'm more than happy to have the iconoclast that's going to be in the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines and says, hey, sir, all I want to do for the next 20 years is code. Okay, how good are you? I'm really good. I'm a 50X guy. Okay, let's have you. That's not a model that we necessarily always have. That's something that we've been moving towards in some of the services, but I think that's something that we've got to accept. If you want to keep that talent, they've got to do exactly what they want to do, which is work within this domain.
It's going to look different from some of the other commands, potentially. I mean, it's going to be interesting, your relationship, I think, with those other commands. And when something needs to be done, when there's a military mission, and, you're going to have another command saying, we could do this with tanks, with airplanes. You could say, we could do this with cyber. Is that how it's going to be? Are you going to be almost offering something different with different people? Or are you going to be integrated in how you offer solutions to the president and to the Joint Chiefs?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think that in both cases. So already we're looking at how do you integrate this idea of cyber within our other warfighting commands. This comes back to what we've done with Joint Task Force Ares. How do you work with U.S. Central Command under General Joe Votel or U.S. Special Operations Command under General Tony Thomas? We've already started to do that. But what are the other areas that maybe someday that, there's some type of capability that Cybercom has that you're the supported command? You have that type of capability that, that is important at that time and place of your choosing that the nation wants to leverage. I think I see that day coming.
So it might be if there's a military attack that's about to happen, you might be called on to support that by switching off the air defense or doing something to the other country in preparation for a military strike, that kind of activity.
So I would say there's a wide range of activities that we could consider, but I think the important thing here is to think of, so how best do we utilize this force in defense of the nation? And I think that's where we're really starting to explore our thoughts and how best do we ensure the defense of our nation and the importance of the securing of our nation as well.
Okay. I think we now got some time for questions from the floor. So if you could indicate with your hand, I'll go to this lady first. Just say briefly who you are. Wait for the microphone, please. Hopefully there is a microphone coming over here. We got mics? Yep, here comes a mic.
I'm Jane Sherman from Bloomfield Hills, Michigan. This may be, some of this is a little above some of us, our heads, but I think I've got most of it. But I want to ask you a question. You talked about our enemies are going below the line. I want to know what's going to bring them above, could bring them above the line. That's number one. Number two, and this may be for the Department of Homeland Security, but what are we doing to stop the social media creating terrorism, terrorist groups, et cetera, that's been rampant throughout the world, and I know it is here. Is that for the Homeland Security, or is that in your department?
So if I can take the latter first, I would say the Deputy Attorney General this week really hit it on the head as he talked about, the different ways that we're looking at malign influence operations. And I think going back to his piece is spot on. He's done a very good job in outlining how we're going to go forward. Above the threshold of war, I would offer, if a nation state decided to attack our critical infrastructure, I would say that's above the threshold level of war, and we would certainly respond. That would be an example of where I would anticipate that a policy decision would be made, and certainly we would react.
But interfering in an election wouldn't be seen necessarily as that level. That's where it gets interesting, isn't it?
So again, these are policy decisions upon which our
Sure.
national leaders decide. Again, I think the important thing for us is what are the options that we can present to those policymakers in the future.
Okay, and I've got a question here from the gentleman in the front. The microphone is on its way.
First General, thanks for coming out here and speaking to us. You've said that your mission is protect the network, protect the data, protect the weapon system. In my previous job as one of the chief buyers of weapon systems, one of the things that worried me was cyber attack on our weapon systems. So how do you protect a DDG, the SCADA of a DDG, an F-35, which is a bucket of flying software that happens to drop ordnance, a Patriot battery, which spoofing of a Patriot battery could have devastating effects. Could you address protection of the weapon system?
So I think it begins with baking that security in as opposed to an afterthought, right? As we design these systems, how do we ensure that we've thought about the security not only from external attacks, but also from the idea of an internal attack like cyber. I think the second piece is that these are systems that operate on networks. One of the most effective things we do on networks is to continue to hunt on networks. So we should never be satisfied with the idea that our adversaries aren't trying to penetrate our weapon systems and our networks. And the third thing I would say is that we continue to ensure that we've got optimal intelligence on what our adversaries are trying to do. Those are three ways that I'd offer that are really important ways upon which we defend our weapon systems.
And got to look after the supply chain. That's increasingly important, isn't it, in cyber?
So certainly, and again, I come back to this idea of the perspective of thinking about the security of the weapon system before it's even designed. I think that's critical as we think about the future.
Okay, let's have some more questions. Lady here.
Hi, Dina Temple-Raston with National Public Radio. So when we talk about offensive cyber, a lot of times we talk about what's called a cyber bomb. Could you explain exactly what a cyber bomb is and perhaps give us an example of how it would work?
No. So,
Okay.
and I don't mean to be glib about that, but I would offer that I'm not really understanding what a cyber bomb is. Here's what I do understand. There are a number of different actions that we certainly do upon which we can create outcomes on our adversaries. And that's everything from, exploit that adversary, to disrupt that adversary, to conduct operations to destroy their physical hardware or their software. And I think that's probably more of the language that I would use. But thank you very much.
Gentleman here.
General David Sanger from the New York Times. Thank you very much for coming out to do this today. I wanted to press you a little bit on the persistent engagement concept that you had here. So I've talked to people in and out of Cyber Command and others who think about this. They're trying to get their heads around the question of how this differs from traditional preemption and what the risks would be. So try this question by example. If you went into an adversary network, China, Russia, name whatever country it would be, and you thought you saw an attack massing, that you wanted to go act preemptively, because as you've said, by the time it comes here, it's sort of too late. First of all, would you still always require presidential authorization? Because persistent engagement would mean moving pretty quickly. And secondly, do you have a risk that as soon as you act first, of course, the other country is going to say, we weren't getting ready to attack you. You just attacked a group of people who were putting together educational software for kindergartners or something. And you'd have a very difficult time proving the opposite, at least in public, even if you were convinced. So talk us a little bit through the risks of escalation here.
So I'd offer with anything, any operation that our military forces do, first of all, there's going to be authorities upon which they operate, right? So however those authorities are done, whether or not it's in cyber or on the ground or in the sea, commanders are going to operate based upon those authorities and move forward on that. The second thing that's always going to be done is deconfliction. So we're going to deconflict in terms of the targets that we're looking at. In terms of preemption versus persistent engagement, my idea I would offer as we look at the vision, so one of the things is that we are constantly engaged. It's not just an offensive engagement, but it's also a defensive engagement as well. In terms of the targets that we might engage, I think that's obviously one of the areas that would be a broader discussion in terms of what has the impact. What do we want to send a message to our adversaries? What is certainly a target that is both lawful and is one that we would want to engage. So these are obviously questions and elements that would be involved in this idea of persistent engagement, but it's something that I think that we are looking at very, very carefully, and one that I think has a lot of merit as we move forward, particularly as we look at such things as where malware is placed, or what our adversaries may be doing upon which they may be stealing our intellectual property. These are all areas that I think offer some ideas that persistent engagement may actually have some merit.
Question over here.
Hi, my name is Ian Murtaugh, raised in Aspen, Colorado. I just wanted to ask how do you keep up with the technology? It's constantly evolving, constantly changing, and it seems like every other day something new comes out. I just wanted to figure out how you kept up with that.
We hire the best and the brightest. and that's truly the most important thing that we do are the people that understand the technology, that develop the technology, that have the partnerships to leverage the technology. That's the piece that we often don't talk enough about in cyberspace is the human element. And those people are the ones that understand it best, that give us the greatest ideas, that develop that technology. That is the component that makes us different, I would offer.
Question at the back.
My name is Gary Davis, Aspen, Colorado. How do you work with Homeland Security in terms of the domestic economy, or the domestic situation, both in terms of organized groups and rogue lone warriors? And is there an overlap or duplication? Is it efficient?
So we work closely through Department of Homeland Security with our sector-specific agents. And so as we take a look at the different critical infrastructure elements throughout our nation, of which there's 17, we partner very closely with DHS and that sector-specific agency that has the requirements. So let me give you an example. Finance. And so as we take a look at the financial industry, we not only partner with Department of Homeland Security, but also the Department of Treasury. Again, the lead for this is Department of Homeland Security. So the idea of this close partnership is something that is really etched in us, and one of the things that I think we have done a lot to work over the past couple years. Is it duplicative? No, I think it's one of the things that I would offer, that we continue to work at every single day to improve those partnerships. And I would say that's one of the things that we had learned over the past several years is, that protection is only as good as the partnership that we develop.
Okay, let's have a question over here.
Hi, General. Thanks so much for your service and for doing this. I'm Andrew Weiss from the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. When we look at what happened with Russia in 2016, at the end of his presidency, President Obama came out and basically said something to the effect of, we need to be mindful of the dangers of escalation. And he didn't exactly say this, but a cyber expert said to me, we have the sharpest rocks, but we live in the glassiest house. And I'm sort of curious, when you look at an adversary like Russia, which has a society that's far less digitized, what is our relative advantage in confronting an adversary which sees escalation, audacity, lack of embarrassment as its key attributes?
Yeah, so I come back again. I think that as we think about strategic engagement and the idea of the adversaries that we must focus on early on and into the future, and that's Russia and China, I would offer that we have to have some manner upon which we're going to look at being able to contest them in places like cyberspace. If we don't, if we decide that we're going to stand on the sidelines, that we're not going to bring the powers of our nation against our adversaries in cyberspace, and that's more than just cyber, right? It's the whole capabilities that our nation has. I think, again, that we run the risk of our adversaries defining what they're going to do within this domain. And so I certainly understand that these are decisions and certainly discussions that have to take place in terms of what's the cost benefit. But that discussion, I think, has to take place. And I think that discussion also has to take place with the idea of, are we going to contest our adversaries in this new domain?
Contesting them does risk escalation. That's the risk that's in there when you're doing that cost-benefit analysis.
So it could, but may not. Maybe our adversaries do not want to escalate. Maybe that they want to use cyberspace in terms of, again, being lower than a threshold of armed conflict. But again, my concern is that if we do not bring the elements of our nation's power against our adversaries in this space, if we don't decide that contesting them or engaging them is important, then I think our adversaries have a much easier time of defining what they're going to do.
Okay, we're nearly out of time, but I've got time for, I think, just a couple of questions. One here.
Thank you. That's okay. Courtney Kuby from NBC News. We had DNI Coates here a couple of days ago, and one of the things he said was that the U.S. has to be relentless in terms of calling out the Russians for what they're doing. A couple of months ago at a forum, the deputy director of operations for the NSA, said that the U.S. does not have the political fortitude to say how it will strike back yet against Russian influence operations. Do you agree with that? Have you seen any change in that the U.S. may actually start calling out the Russians and talking about how they'll respond?
So I'm not familiar with the person at the National Security Agency that offered that comment. But I would offer, here's what I would say. We have to, as a nation, bring all of the elements of our power together against our adversaries. So whether it's in the information sphere, the economic sphere, the military sphere, we have to address our adversaries with the combined weight of what we have. We have a tremendous amount of combined weight with our capabilities. And so I think that's the best way that I would offer a response to that. And certainly I think it's among the most important things that we do.
Just, her name is Natalie Lang.
Okay, I think I've got one question here.
My name is Hank Turalkovich. General, it's great to hear your views. Let me see. Multiple hats come with multiple bosses. So 2 months into your new job, how's that going?
So I guess the first way I could say is you could probably ask my bosses. My perspective is it's going really well. In all seriousness, here's what I would say is that I get great guidance from the Secretary of Defense, the Director of National Intelligence. I have tremendous people that work with me and for me. It's not hard for me to understand what their guidance is. And I've been able to do that at least over the past 70 days. And I really appreciate the steerage that they've given me and certainly the work that my folks have done. So thanks.
And it's true, isn't it, that the two hats could be separated? That's one of the things that's being looked at under a review. But you'd still have to work very closely with NSA Cyber Command, wouldn't it, if that was the outcome?
So certainly pre-decisional, but whatever decision is made, the partnership between the National Security Agency and U.S. Cyber Command is going to be one that is critically important to our nation. So whether or not it's one person or two people, that partnership I would offer is the most important thing that we should think about.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Over here, please.
Thank you, General, and thank you as well. I was hoping to see a tie today, but my question, or I guess my name is Turner Holcomb. I'm a cadet from the U.S. Air Force Academy, and my question has to do with the future of warfare being a hybrid type, where we not only worry about deterrence with near-peer competitors, but also the threat of violent extremist organizations. What do you do to prepare for both of those threats?
So I would offer the lesson that I've learned over my career is that you train the best people to be the best leaders to operate in a variety of different domains. For the past 17 years, our nation has, I would offer, done incredible work against violent extremist organizations. Take a look at what the intelligence community, what our operational forces have done to collect information, to analyze that information, to provide that information forward to ensure the protection of our forces and the security of our nation. Incredible amount of work. I would offer from a person that was at the Pentagon on 9/11, that has been a tremendous learning experience for all of us. And so the future in terms of how we're going to address these different threats, the one constant we'll have and the one constant will be successful is really great people. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. It just leaves for me to say thank you all for coming. Thank you for attending a wonderful forum. Thank you for the organizers for doing it. And thank you above all for General Nakasone for giving us such a great ending to this forum. Thank you.